My name is David Auble. I am so glad to see everybody here. And I'm very happy to be able to introduce this evening's guest teacher. Donald Rothberg lives in Berkeley, California, but he has roots in Charlottesville, almost. Spent portions of his childhood and teenage years, young adulthood, passing through Charlottesville and in the various areas, and he'll probably say more about that since I clearly can't tell this story. Anyway, it's really nice to welcome him here. Donald's been meditating for over 40 years, and he's a tireless teacher. His sort of main affiliation is with Spirit Rock, where he is on the Teachers Council, but he teaches all over the U.S. and outside the U.S. and in a range of different areas: insight practice, loving kindness, skillful speech. I understand he just came from Louisville, where he taught a 4-day retreat on the judgmental mind. But a particular area of interest of his has to do with how we learn to bring our personal practice into daily life and into the causes and concerns, whatever they may happen to be, on a personal or interpersonal or societal or a larger level. So I'm very excited to hear what he has to say.
So it is good to be here. I do have, through my family and through my upbringing, a connection to Virginia. And as David mentioned, I grew up in the D.C. area and made at least a few trips to Charlottesville to see Monticello and other places to get to know the area. Went hiking in the Blue Ridge and so forth. And then in about 1970, my parents moved down to Richmond. And my father took a position at Medical College of Virginia as a researcher. He was a biochemist. And my mother took a position with the school system connected with court-ordered desegregation. And she later became really the leader of what was then called race relations within the school system. So she was right in the middle of that, doing what we would now call diversity work. And at a pretty intense time, which probably had its parallels here in Charlottesville, for those of you who were here then, right? So, and around that time also, we got some land in Highland County. People know Highland County and I think we were able to get it for like about $60 an acre, which is pretty good, and didn't get too much, and my brother and I built a cabin there, and I kept on spending time there and coming from Richmond through Charlottesville all the time, sometimes stopping. Right, so this is my first time back in Charlottesville, I think, for 30 years, because I moved to California about 30 years ago. And previous to that, I was a teacher at the University of Kentucky. And I taught actually in the philosophy department, also taught meditation at that time, sort of on the side, was going to Southern Dharma, not so far away, and would drive back from Lexington, Kentucky to Richmond, and come through Charlottesville all the time and go through Highland and so forth. So it's good to be here, and I know a lot has happened here last few years, or 2 years ago particularly, right? So it's good to be here and find out some of what is on your minds in terms of your sense of practice and so forth. And I thought for tonight I would talk about the most important possible spiritual topic. You up for that? So what is it? What am I going to talk about? What's the most important possible spiritual topic? Anyone want to guess? Come on. Compassion. Engagement. Relationship. Bringing practice into everyday life. You might have read the the blurb. Yeah. Well, actually, that's the correct answer. But I like to be playful a little bit. If I hadn't put the blurb in, we could have gone with that for a little while longer. So, yeah, what I think the most important thing for our practice is to make this practice real in all the parts of our lives. And so that's what I want to explore tonight. And talk about it maybe for, I don't know, maybe 40 minutes or so, and then have some time to talk together. And I thought I would start really a little bit autobiographically that I met actually Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield in 1976 and was starting practicing. I'd done some meditation before that, but really that was very important. And I was living in Massachusetts at the time, so I was able to go pretty soon to retreats at the Insight Meditation Society, and it really just connected very, very deeply with my aspirations. I had been, sort of my first awakenings were more as an activist, coming of age and being very concerned with issues of the Vietnam War, racism. I think those are the main ones, and how does social change come about? And yet I was also very aware in those being engaged in those ways that I wasn't so sure that I wanted to be part of the social change that some of my friends and colleagues were espousing, right? That we didn't always treat each other so well. There were contradictions, in other words. And so it was really a question, how to, is there an inner component, an ethical component? What's the inner and ethical component to social change, to working for social change? Of course, a lot of people have answered that question, but that was very alive. And the finding of this inner practice was part of an answer to that question, really, how to work with one's own conditioning, one's own, in Buddhist language, greed, hatred, and delusion, with what gets in the way of clear seeing and compassion and so forth. And so I fell in love with this practice, as many of you have, through the retreats, and I was able to convince, I was doing, in the late 70s, doing graduate work, and I was able to convince the people at Insight Meditation Society to let me stay in a cottage that was right across the street. It's now staff housing, but I was around, I was aware that they were buying the building. I said, how about if I stay there and work on my studies 5 or 6, 7 hours a day and practice maybe 10 hours a day? And they said, yeah, and I proposed to do it for 9 months. And I think Joseph Goldstein helped me with that, but they said yes, and so I actually stayed there. So I was really deep into practice, and I was also thinking that I would finish my graduate degree and then go to Asia. And in my mind, it was like I would get to some level of enlightenment or other and come back and see what was next, right? And interestingly, along the way, I think I remember I was invited to work with a group of elders in an elder program. And something really came alive with that kind of teaching. I mean, I'd been doing some teaching while I was a graduate student, including teaching meditation and starting to teach meditation, I taught a class, I think, in Asian philosophy. And something shifted in my thinking, and with that teaching, working with elders, and I decided not to go to Asia, and instead I ended up going to rural Ohio. Okay, because I decided to take a position in schools and universities, and my vision was that I really thought I wanted to really explore what a contemporary path of practice would look like in the world, not so much to continue. And I also felt that doing all the meditation, I was getting a little imbalanced, right? It was like I was meditating so much, and it was like sometimes hard to relate to people. Some of you may find that when you do a lot of meditation. Also, I was young and still working stuff out. All that's complete, of course, at this point. But in any case, so I had this vision that I was really drawn to help clarify, we might say, what a contemporary path of awakening might be, and how to bring the practice into all parts of one's life. And that was really what actually, for better or worse, took me to try to, okay, I'll go. So I spent 7 years in rural Ohio and Kentucky. Lexington, Kentucky. It's not rural, but, and really trying to see what that vision was. What are the forms of practice which are appropriate for working with our conditioning? The various kinds of conditioning we have, which are different than you find in Asia, certainly different than from 2,500 years ago in some ways. Some things are more universal. And so I had that vision, and then I think in the blurb I quoted from the Tibetan teacher Shabkar, who has a very powerful one-line guide, which says, "Let your life and practice be one." And that's certainly been my aspiration. I'm sure that is also the aspiration for many of us. And yet, that's sometimes hard. And I was also reflecting that for certain historical reasons, there's been, particularly in the insight tradition, there's a very strong emphasis on formal practice, on formal meditation practice, particularly sitting meditation, which of course is tremendously valuable and powerful, but it's interesting to know the history there. There's some interesting history, because when you look to how practice generally is in Asia, particularly in the monastic traditions, it really does go into all the parts of people's lives. And some of you may have studied Ajahn Chah, the great Thai teacher of Jack Cornfield and Ajahn Sumedho and others, who I got to study with some. And Ajahn Chah used to find people in the monastery who he thought were a little bit hung up on meditation and send them to Bangkok, right? Or in some way shake them up a little bit because something was not full for them. And so it's interesting. And I'll just give a little bit of historical background because it's very interesting. I think there are ways that we are still looking to find that sense of an integrative path in insight meditation. That there's been, in our communities, quite a strong emphasis on retreats, right? And on doing retreats. And interestingly, some of this comes out of the peculiar development that occurred in Burma at the end of the 19th and 20th century. I don't know if many of you know this, but in 1850, in both Burma and Thailand, which are really the places out of which our practice comes, in 1850 there was almost no meditation going on. Did you know that? It certainly wasn't what I thought. And there's a recent history called The Birth of Insight, a book by Eric Braun, came out about 6 years ago. And he traced some of the history. Basically, meditation retreats such as we know them, came especially out of the Burmese context in the beginning of the 20th century as a conscious response to colonialism. There was a monk named Ledi Sayadaw who, in his own education, never learned meditation. That was typical in Burma, also Thailand. And he was concerned that the British completed their colonizing of Burma in 1885, and he and many people knew there was a prophecy that Buddhism would die out in Burma. And he thought that the way to avoid this was actually to offer retreats so people could learn meditation, not because he thought meditation was so cool, but meditation was a key to understanding the Abhidhamma, the Buddhist psychology, which is somewhat esoteric and not so much studied in the West. And so he started meditation retreats. They really caught on. People like Mr. Goenka took them, the form of a 10-day meditation retreat, open to women, open to lay people. Not really happened much like that before. And that led to people like Mahasi Sayadaw developing similar formats. That's the format that got brought over to the West. And there was a really strong focus on meditation. And in that format, there wasn't so much a focus on the rest of daily life practice, right? And so that got connected also with, I think, what was this strong interest among many Westerners in inner spiritual practices, because in large part, the Western religions had largely lost their contemplative and mystical dimensions, certainly in the previous 300 or 400 years. Some of the loss goes back to the Middle Ages, right? And so the contemplative and mystical dimensions of Christianity, Judaism, especially, were not available. And many of the people who brought insight meditation here, found what they were looking for in Burma and Thailand, and they brought it over here, and the thirst for that inner work was very strong. And one could go very deeply in meditation retreats, and yet the integration was less central. I think has been less central to our practice. Is that fair to say in your experience? Right? And I know, so I had this vision of more integrative practice, and these were the realities, and it was sometimes frustrating. I loved the deep, intensive practice, but I had this interest in the other forms of practice, and so that's what I want to explore. Because I think we're still, in some ways, at an early stage in knowing what those practices look like. And for me, it's been just a draw to try to help delineate what are the different ways to deepen daily life practice, and what are the different elements of daily life practice that almost have to be further developed. That's what I want to explore for the rest of the evening. And I think what I'll do is I'll talk generally about sort of 3 levels of bringing the practice more into daily life. 3 ways of deepening daily life practice. I think also I would say not just deepening, but broadening, having a broader sense of how we practice. And that practice, I think, takes place individually and with working with our own minds and hearts and actions and behavior. It also happens relationally in our families, in our friendships, in our partnerships, in our work, in our communities. And it also happens on a larger social and collective level, right? And in a way, all of those actually interpenetrate, right? It's not quite, I'm not going to get too detailed, but obviously some of our inner work is dealing with how we internalize social conditioning, right? That's a big chunk of our inner work, whether it's working with internalized gender conditioning, racial conditioning, conditioning related to essentially all the 10 or 20 social hierarchies that we have in our society, right? Age, gender, race, sexual orientation, educational level, whatever, appearance. You could probably fill out another 10, right? Right. Okay. So first, just to talk about more foundational experience, because I think people here are at different places in their practice. And certainly for me, I think for many of us, very valuable just to maybe initially focus on the formal practice. That's certainly what I did, to focus and to have that become stable in one's life. And for some of us, that might mean that the cutting edge of deepening daily life practice is simply to have a regular formal practice. That's everyone's edge at some point, right? And so for some of us, that might be the main learning edge right now, right? And when I'm going to speak about a number of ways to deepen, and what I'm inviting is listen for the one or two ways of deepening and broadening that I mentioned that resonate with you. I might mention 20 or 30. I'm not encouraging you to do all 20 or 30. Okay? But see which one or two really call you. And it'll be in multiple dimensions. So initially, just have a daily practice can be a great way to deepen. As we have a regular daily practice, another way of deepening may be to have a longer sitting. Do a second formal practice session. Because what we're looking for eventually is to have this sense of the intention to be present and kind, compassionate, there more and more in our daily lives. That's the fruit of all of this, right? It's to have that be present more and more, and in a sense, more and more natural, right? So, and a lot of us may have that even as just part of our nature, right? That we maybe by who we are and maybe the fruits of our upbringing, if we were fortunate, maybe we lead with kindness in our lives. That's wonderful if that's the case. So we might have more sessions in a day, we might have a second session in the evening. One of the practices that I have found very useful is finding some natural times during the day where I can be mindful, or maybe I do loving kindness practice in a way that doesn't add any more time to my schedule. That's not another item on my to-do list. That most likely will not work. But if you can find some activity that you do or some way of being, could be, okay, I will always, in washing the dishes, be mindful. Maybe that clicks with you. Or it could be, like for me, I do a knee exercise generally every morning. Takes about 10 minutes. Not very involved. It's practice. Yeah. Another one that I do personally is I like to do lap swimming, and I'm looking for a good pool in Charlottesville. So I'm sure there is. Okay, you can tell me. So I like to do lap swimming, and in my lap swimming, I do loving kindness practice the whole time. It really works. It's like my loving kindness practice. Generally, I have about 16 or 18 people, and I just go through them. One lap per person. One lap of loving, but you get the idea that it's to find. So some of us, it might be you take public transportation. that becomes mindfulness practice, where you're not adding any time to your schedule, right? Maybe you take a walk here and there, or maybe you walk a certain amount of time. I know when I was first practicing, I lived in Boston. I didn't have a car, and I walked everywhere and took public transportation. And I had this quote-unquote brilliant insight at a certain point that if I took all my walking, which sometimes was like an hour a day, and turned that into practice, I'd have much more. I would complain, not enough time, too much studies, right? And so some of it's finding, if you can find 1 or 2 10-minute periods in which you can not add anything new to your schedule, no more demands, but you simply switch what you're doing, that can really deepen things, can be really, really very helpful. Of course, reading is helpful to deepen daily life practice. Being in a group like this, connecting with others. Maybe you have a friend that you contact maybe once a week or more about your practice. You email or something, or text. Something like that can be really, really helpful. Following the ethical guidelines is a really important way to bring the practice into our relationships. So this is also another way of extending the practice outwards, and to have a sense of non-harming be more and more alive in us. And of course, one of the ethical precepts is to follow certain guidelines of speech, and that's a whole area that is so fundamental. I teach 6 and 7 day speech retreats with my colleague Oren Sofer. And Oren just came out with a book called Say What You Mean, which is a great book as a starting point for speech practice. And in my book, The Engaged Spiritual Life, I have several chapters also on speech practice. And that is a tremendous way to bring practice further into daily life. And it's, we have a fairly developed curriculum, and we found ourselves needing to really innovate. Some of what we use comes from Buddhist tradition, and there we use particularly certain guidelines for skillful speech, being truthful, helpful, coming out of a kind heart, although sometimes saying hard things with a kind heart, and then having good timing. Those are the 4 guidelines, but we found it really important to actually fill out speech practice. We use the discipline of nonviolent communication. Some of you have probably practiced that. How many of you know that? Yeah. And we bring that in under, actually, but more under the framework of Buddhist practice. And we use it in certain ways, sort of as a subset of mindfulness in certain ways, and ways of focusing here. And then we also have developed what we call relational awareness practices, which help one to develop a sense of presence, mindfulness, and awareness in the midst of action and interaction. This is not easy, and I think this kind of training isn't offered too much. We should probably train other people, so it's not just dependent on us. And make a mental note. But the practice can be really wonderful to bring a sense of presence and the intention to understand, connect, have empathy, compassion into all of one's interactions and being with others. And needless to say, if one's going into social engagement, skillful speech is crucial, right, in all sorts of ways. And so, all of a sudden, how many people here have a hard time or even complain about finding 20 to 30 minutes a day for mindfulness practice? For how many people is that a little challenging? Okay. Well, if that's challenging and you turn your speech practice into a focused practice, guess what? Many of us have 5 or 10 hours for rigorous spiritual practice. So that's a horizon. That's a way really of broadening the practice. It does, I think, someone can do with the guidance from recordings, and Yeah, yeah. My colleague Oren just is doing like an online class that just started like 5 days ago, so that might still be available. And like an 8-week online class, doing a lot of what we offer in the retreats. But that's a whole area that is very fundamental. So being in groups, for those of you who haven't done retreats, starting retreats can be a way of deepening practice, because that really it can deepen our concentration level, which can play a big role. And as we practice more, one of the very positive things about practice is that as our concentration deepens, or as we deepen it in retreats, it actually, the learning lasts. The research shows that concentration is actually can be learned. So it's not back to square one. If you keep practicing, over the years, your concentration level will get higher and higher if you stay with it. It's not back to square one each time. So that really points to another way of deepening practice. This is more with formal practice, which is to focus on one area like concentration or insight and give some special focus. Maybe it's to bring the heart practices more into one's life. The heart practices, loving kindness, compassion, joy, equanimity, and so forth. And the practices of loving kindness and compassion are also wonderful practices to bring further into daily life, to deepen daily life. Practice, those are wonderful because they're very, very transferable. I mentioned doing loving kindness while swimming laps. You can do loving kindness while doing public transportation. A lot of my students do loving kindness practice while driving. Anyone do that? Yeah. It's really amenable. I have several people who are in the helping professions who are able to bring loving kindness into work. One of my students works as a midwife. She says she's able to keep loving kindness going most of the day in her work. Right? That is possible. Right? Again, for doing that, it can be really helpful. Maybe you have a few friends who are in the helping professions. Can you bring that into, make it a group and work with people together to support each other? So the heart practices can really be brought into daily life very, very successfully. For some of us, the broadening of our practice may be to see, sometimes we see through our mindfulness practice that there are parts of our being that are needing attention. And we may do psychological work to really help us deepen and broaden our practice or bring it into daily life more. Or we might find that we have unresolved trauma, right? That is important to work with, that can make it harder to deepen. One of the areas I teach on, as David mentioned, I call it transforming the judgmental mind. And I find that many people have been practicing a long time and still have these, particularly self-judgment, as a strong conditioning. It's very strong in our culture, right? And so sometimes focusing in that way can be another way to deepen practice. And I find I sometimes have taught our long retreats, our 1 month and 2 month retreats at Spirit Rock, and I find very dedicated people who may have practiced 20 or 30 years, there's still a knot around self-judgment, right, which can be there. And so looking to see where there might be maybe some focused work in some area is another way to deepen. And of course, then finding ways to bring the practice more into one's relationships, into community life. Speech practice is very good. Another area that we'll explore on Saturday is how to be skillful with conflict. Because at a certain point, one of the things that can become really interesting in our practice, this is not necessarily at the beginning, is to actually take challenges and difficulties as an important learning place for our practice. Maybe some of you do this, but to anyone especially say, here's a difficulty or challenge. Let me look at how many of you work in some way consciously with that. There's some beautiful phrases that come from the Tibetan tradition. One of them says, "Turn all obstacles into the path of practice." It's from the Lojong teachings. And there's another line which I like a lot from Tibetan tradition. It says, "When the sun shines and my belly is full, I look like a Dharma practitioner. But it is when difficulties arise that my faults are exposed." Right? And so that could be amazing, and that's not necessarily a beginning intention, right? But at a certain point, we can get interested in our difficulties. And we have these beautiful tools, the tools of mindfulness and wisdom and compassion. The heart practices are amazing tools for working with difficulties, interpersonal difficulties, different kinds of conflicts. That can be an emphasis. Let me work with my difficulties. And again, starting with not the most intense ones, right? Working up. When I work with conflict, we work with judgmental mind, we don't start with the most intense ones. I like to have a scale of 1 to 10. We start with the 3s and 4s and 5s. We don't go right to the 9s or 10s. All training is based on that model. So taking the challenges in that way can be a wonderful way to deepen practice. Remember, I'm giving all of these suggestions. Take 1 or 2, right? Don't do all of them. Okay. Remember, there was research done at Stanford on how people change habits, or how, we could generalize it, how we deepen our practice. And I think there were 3 guidelines. One of them is do it bite size. Don't try to do too much. So take on maybe one of these and commit to it for a week. Something like that. So do it. The first one was do it bite size. The second guideline was, if you can, attach something new to something that's already established. Right? So maybe you, maybe you have the habit of taking a walk after lunch, so just turn it into mindfulness. For me, when I go swimming, there's no way that metta doesn't happen. Sorry for my high school English teacher was noticing the double negative and hanging above my shoulder. Miss Baker, she was terrifying. Anyway, but I learned a lot. Okay, you probably have had similar experience. Terrifying, but I learned a lot, right? Okay. Right, and so that's the second one. A change in one's practice or behavior, connect it with something that's established. If you can, that'll strengthen it, make it easier. And the third one is give yourself a reward when you've done it. Okay, of your choosing. Okay, so. And then as we deepen practice, we may find it necessary to take on further supports. I know at a certain point I asked teachers to mentor me. And that was really crucial. It helps with accountability. And so I would meet with someone every 2 weeks or so. Right? And played a very important role in learning, accountability, but having supports of mentors, teachers, again, could be a friend. I now meet with someone who's really a peer, who's been practicing about the same amount of time and more or less same level of depth. We talk on the phone together every 2 weeks for about an hour about our practice. It's really important for both of us. Something like that can really, really be helpful. So just a few other suggestions, and I want to open things up. One thing I haven't mentioned so far, I think is really important for our daily life, and that is grounding in the body. And a lot of you, I know, that has been an emphasis, but in a culture that is so cerebral, and where we're on, in a virtual world a lot, the grounding in the body makes a huge difference. And so I know for me, that's been a focus quite a number of times in my own practice, right at the beginning, and then about over 20 years into my practice, I had like really focused 4 years of developing more body awareness. And we found also that the body awareness is really crucial for developing more of a sense of presence in speech practice, right? And so whatever way we develop more body awareness, doing more walking meditation, yoga, qigong, some of us, just trying to, I found it very helpful to really accelerate that learning in retreats. And I could say more, but we could do a whole evening or a day on that, just grounding further in the body. Really, really important. One practice which I've done for about 35 years, which can be really helpful, is a Sabbath practice, where you take 1 day a week, and you can take anywhere maybe from 3 hours to the whole day, and you make it a time of practice. I generally take Wednesdays as my Sabbath day. And for me, I actually teach at Spirit Rock often on Wednesdays in the morning, and then I stay there and I practice the rest of the day. So I might get 6 or 8 hours of formal practice. It's like going back into retreat once a week, right? It can really be significant for deepening. Some of us, 3 hours is a really great way to deepen, right? Maybe half a day, you do it with other people. It's an old tradition. And it also, you can unplug and get some renewal. I find it just really crucial to partly to, breaking the habitual energy can be really, really helpful. And of course, related to that, as we deepen, we also may change our priorities. We may decide that I want to do more focused practice or focus on this aspect of practice. Or I may, given the state of the world, I may want to focus more on engaged practice, which I haven't mentioned so much. But there's, the book I did came out of about 15 years of working with training programs for people who were wanting to connect inner practices with social service and social change work. I think that vision is deeply needed in our world now. That it's almost like a new model of social change is ready to come more fully into being. I think the old model of kind of self-righteousness, antagonism, demonization of the enemy, polarization, I think has reached certain limits, which we can see, and it's still there. But I think there are ways of really, and a lot of us have been trying to work. How do you bring together what's most valuable in the Western social justice traditions with the inner practices? For me, it's a powerful vision. And as I was saying, the book I did was kind of like a manual for doing that. That was based on about 15 years of experience working with training programs for people combining these two aspects. And there's still a long way to go on this, to really do it. And maybe I'll just end with a few thoughts. One is I think it's deeply needed. That is deeply needed at our time. And I talk with someone. Some people know what to do, right? Some people know where they're. Some people feel called to engagement as part of their lives, and others not so much at this time. But I have discussions with a lot of people I work with as students, like, what do I do? And one thing I have found myself saying is I ask them, how much time do you want to devote to some way of responding to collective issues? Which could happen in all sorts of ways. In our training programs, we had people who were doing service work, maybe working in prisons or working with the homeless. We had people doing policy work. We had people who were activists, kind of quite a mix. It's a broad range. And what I have found myself saying is, see what issue you're drawn to work on. Clarify how much time you want to devote each week. Like one person I was working with a month or two ago, she said, I want to work with climate issues. Okay. And how much time do you want to devote? 5 hours a week. Okay? Got clarity. Then research your options. Find the groups and see what is a possibility. She did that, and she found a group that she really felt comfortable with, and it feels like a great fit. It's doable. It's clear. That's not a bad way to, if you're not clear where you want to act, that's not a bad model, right? And so I think, many of us feel like this is such a critical time, and it obviously is, right? In all sorts, we could name all the systemic issues that are up. And one thing that I think is hopeful is I remember from, I sometimes teach retreats on the connection of the nonviolence of Gandhi and King with Dharma. There's a very deep connection, there. And I have a colleague I sometimes teach with named Kazu Haga. And Kazu told me of a study that was done about 10 years ago, which studied nonviolent movements throughout history in all sorts of settings, in democratic societies, in dictatorships. And what the study found is that when 2.5% of the population or more is involved, nonviolent movements have universally succeeded. So there's something about finding one's call to be involved, and we need ways to have this get stronger, obviously. But I think that this combination of deep inner practice connected with finding ways to have it be an inner practice, have it be a relational practice, and then have it come out into the larger world, that seems part of what's necessary to respond at this difficult time. Maybe I'll stop there. So, thank you. Thanks for your listening, and thanks for your practice.